Happy Sabbath. Tonight, we are going to study chapter 17 of Revelation. But just like before we get into the new chapter, I like to do a little bit of a recap. In chapter 15 to 16, these two chapters portray a lifelike picture of the consequence of the world because of the rejection of God's law and his plan of salvation. And Paul said, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap." Galatians 6:7. So those who have been destroying the earth will experience their own destruction. Although these events seem terrifying and uncharacteristic of God, especially coming from the loving God we know in the gospel. Professor from Andrew University, Dr. Stefanovic, interpreted that there's a purpose in them. He said the trumpet are to wake up the non-believers while there's still time for salvation, and the bowl plagues are the vindications for the persecuted saints. Nevertheless, he explained, these events are in the control of one who cares deeply for the human race, one who loves the human race so much that he was willing to die for it. But there's another scholar explaining it differently. He said the trumpets and the bowl plagues are not from God, but it is a consequence of leaving God's protection and falling into the hands of the enemy. The high point of the seven last plague is the battle of Armageddon. And let me reiterate, Armageddon is heaven's response to the cries of Israel of God for deliverance from the Babylonian oppressor. And it is also an answer of prayer for his people who has been crying, "How long?" And the sixth plague in chapter 16, verse 12, is the preparation for the final battle. And while the battle itself is described in Revelation chapter 16, verse 17, all the way until chapter 19, verse 21. In chapter 16, there is an insert of Christ's advice during the preparation of the final battle of Armageddon. Why is there an insert? Well, let me read the insert first. Christ said, "Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is the one who watches and keeps his garment, so that he does not walk naked and they see his shame." This is in chapter 16, verse 15. The advice is inserted for the purpose of providing a firm assurance to God's people that he is returning soon. And at the same time reminding them to be aware and be watchful because there's lots of deceptions out there. Well, we have experienced lately of how easy it is to fall into deception and believing lies. Well, some people complain to me that they are so confused nowadays and don't even know what is true and what is fake anymore. Can you imagine what this spiritual war would be like at the end? This battle, the Battle of Armageddon, is not a political or military battle, but rather a theological and spiritual one. A quote from the scholar Hans Larondel said, "War predictions of a purely secular nature, detached from Christ and the divine plan of salvation, are no part of the Old Testament covenant prophecies or the New Testament Armageddon war. Yahweh war never was a secular political struggle between nations." So Armageddon is the battle, spiritual battle, for the mind and intellect of every human being on earth. Paul describes the nature of Christian warfare. He said, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. This is recorded in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 3 to 5. Revelation portrays the final battle as part of the cosmic conflict between Christ and his arch antagonist, the devil and Satan, the one who deceived the whole world. The instigator of this battle Armageddon is the same Satan who originated war in heaven, and he lost it there. And in constant frustration, he became enraged at the women. Remember that in chapter 12? And he went away to wage war with the remaining ones of her offspring, the one who keeps the commandments and the testimony of Jesus. The battle of Armageddon represents his firm determination. That means Satan's firm determination and last attempt to destroy God's people and prevent the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Paul made it clear that Satan's activities in the final days will include persuasions, which uses all power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 and 10. Ellen White also gave us a warning. She said, "The time of trouble such as never was is soon to open up upon us, and we shall need an experience which we do not now possess and which many are too indolent or lazy to obtain. It is often the case that trouble is greater in anticipation than in reality, but this is not true of this crisis before us. The most vivid presentation cannot reach the magnitude of the ordeal. In that time of trial, every soul must stand for himself before God." Armageddon is a battle in which all the people of the earth must give allegiance to either God or Satan. The ultimate issue will be regarding who God is, as it was on Mount Carmel. What God did on Mount Carmel, he will do once again in the final battle, and he will win the triumphal victory over the oppressor of his people. Another interesting note. In the book of Revelation, whenever a new power is mentioned, its description is usually given first in general terms, and then it will follow by elaboration or details. So following this pattern, Revelation chapter 16 first mentioned, or also chapter 14 first mentioned, the religio-political power Babylon the Great in its general term. And now in chapter 17, will provide a more detailed description of this end-time Babylon for the purpose of showing the reason for its judgment. And later in chapter 18, we will see the description of her judgment. Now we go into verse 1 of chapter 17. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who dwells on many water." Verse 2. With whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. One of the 7 angels with the bowls invite John to witness the judgment of the great prostitute. Verse 1, right? And this prostitute is later identified as Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, in verse 5. You know, in Revelation, Babylon stands for a short-lived coalition of dragon, beast, and false prophet. Each has its own history, but at the end time, they will join together to deceive and to coerce. Her daughter are the world's religious powers that will unite with the satanic trinity, becoming a religious confederacy in the closing days of this earth history. And this explains why the destruction of Babylon is described as splitting into 3 parts earlier in chapter 16, verse 19. And the breakup with the satanic threesome, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophets, will cause the demise of this end-time religious confederacy. Well, the angel states that the prostitute Babylon dwells on many waters. Jeremiah 51:13 shows us that many waters refers to the Euphrates River. And we had explained earlier that how Babylon was dependent on the Euphrates River, right? Okay. And the angel later explains to John in verse 15 that these waters symbolize the civil, secular, and political world powers. So that indicates Babylon, the confederate end-time religious power, will use the worldwide secular power at the time of the end. These 2 entities, which is religious power and world secular power, are distinct here, and something that was not the case in the past. You know, throughout history and even the Middle Ages, political power and the established religious authority went hand in hand together. In prehistory time, a ruler is seen as an incarnation, manifestation, mediator, or agent of the sacred or holy. For example, in the book of Daniel, the king Nebuchadnezzar has both political and religious power. In chapter 3 of Daniel, we read that he ordered his subjects to worship his gigantic golden statue. So being a king, a secular political ruler, he also ruled religiously. Also, closer in time, the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages held tremendous political power. In some cases, church authorities, notably the Pope, which is the head of the Catholic Church, held more power than kings or queens of that time. And it dominated the Western world during the prophetic 1260 years. And now in our modern Western world, these 2 powers are separate. But at the time of the end, these powers, which are separate and distinct entities, will join together again, will work together again for a common purpose. Just as the ancient Babylon depended on the Euphrates River for its existence, like I mentioned before, so end-time Babylon will depend on this civil, secular, and political world power to enforce its plan and purposes. And this end-time religious confederacy will form an alliance with the governing world powers. And these powers will put themselves into service of this apostate religious system, and which will work against Christ and his faithful people during the end-time crisis. Two groups are specified as being seduced by Babylon in this final crisis. First, the kings of the earth, portrayed as committing adultery with this prostitute Babylon. And these are the governing political world powers. Their adultery is not literal, of course. In the Old Testament, the language of fornication is used frequently to describe Israel aligning itself with pagan nations. We can see that in Isaiah 1:21, Jeremiah 3:1-10, Ezekiel 16, verse 23. In Ezekiel, the prophet charged Judah that you have played the harlot with the nations. The adulterous relationship between the kings of the earth and the prostitute Babylon symbolize an illicit union between the end-time religious confederacy and the world's governing secular political leaders in the final crisis. The second group mentioned here are those who dwell on the earth, who are spiritually drunk with the wine of Babylon's immorality. This is the general populace, not the world's leader. They are also influenced or seduced by this big prostitute, Babylon the Great. So while the world's leader commit adultery with the prostitute Babylon, the rest of the earth's people are intoxicated by Babylon's deceptive teachings and activities, which entice people to worship the beast. The beast was mentioned in chapter 14 and later and also in chapter 18. When people are drunk, that means that they cannot think clearly. When the effect of drunkenness is over, there's a realization of their bad decisions and actions. However, this comes too late. Both groups are equally deceived and have put themselves under the control of Babylon for political and economic benefit. Revelation tells us that at the time of the end, the world will once again be united and religion will dominate in the way that it did during the Middle Ages. The time will come when the world's people will realize the bad choices that they have made and will turn against Babylon. However, it will be too late. Verse 3, 4, 5, 6. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. 4. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. 5. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. 6. And I saw the women drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witness of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. Earlier, in verse 1, John was told that the prostitute Babylon sat on many waters And now he is carried in a vision into the wilderness where he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. And later in verse 9, John was explained by the angel about the 7 mountains the prostitute is sitting on. So it appears that what John sees is a different facet of what he heard before. He first heard the great prostitute sitting on many waters, but what he later sees is a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. And this suggests that waters, the beast, and the 7 mountains all refer to the same thing, namely the secular and political power of the earth. Back to our verse 3. While the prostitute represents the end-time union of religion, the beast symbolizes the worldwide confederacy or unions of political powers. The prophecy tells us that at the end of time, the political powers on earth will put themselves into the service of end-time Babylon. Babylon sitting on the beast means that this religious system will dominate the political powers during the end-time crisis. And the women is pictured as extravagantly dressed in purple and scarlet and lavishly adorned with ornaments of gold and precious stones. She was wearing all the bling-blings, so to say. And she has an inscription on her forehead, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. Scarlet is also the color of blood and oppression. And this corresponds appropriately to the character of this religious system, which is drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus, which is mentioned in verse 6. Purple is the color used for royal attire, and it fits the prostitute's claim to be a queen. And this is in verse 7. The prostitute's dress brings us to remember the attire of also the high priest in the Old Testament, which included purple, scarlet, and gold. You can look at that in Exodus chapter 28, verse 5 and 6. And her forehead inscription resembles the inscription on the mitre of the high priest. Of course, what it is written is totally different. With the high priest, the inscription was, "Holy to the Lord." But the women's inscription is, "Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." Also, she has a cup in her hand, and that reflects the drink offering in the sanctuary. Leviticus 30, verse 9. You can look at that. All this suggests that the Babylon in chapter 17 refers to end-time religious system rather than a political system. With its historic Christian appearance, this end-time religious system becomes Satan's powerful tool to deceive and seduce the world into apostasy during the end-time crisis. Although she appears in religious garb or garment, Babylon is a prostitute and the mother of prostitutes, seducing the world away from God. She is drunk with the blood of the saints who died because of their witness to Jesus Christ. And this religious system, which makes all people drunk with its false teachings, is itself drunk with the blood of Christ's followers. So it makes others drunk by its false teaching, and herself is drunk with the blood of Christ's followers. And this clearly links end-time Babylon to the beast in Revelation chapter 13, which represents medieval apostate Christianity in Western Europe, led by the papacy, which was responsible for the death of millions of Christians during the medieval time. And the time is coming, however, when God will judge this great prostitute and avenge the blood of his servants from her hand. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 6, we just read, John is greatly astonished at this prostitute. Why is he astonished? Well, his reaction denotes he probably recognized this prostitute. He sees her in the desert or the wilderness and recognized her as the women who fled into the wilderness to escape the persecution of the dragon during the 1260-day prophetic time of the Middle Ages, which was recorded in chapter 12, verse 13 to 14. That's interesting, isn't it? So it seems like John was marveled because I've seen these women before. So this suggests that this end-time opponent of God's people was once Christ's faithful church. And this explains why at the time of the end, Satan is filled with great animosity against the remnant of the women's offspring rather than the woman herself. The church that in the past was faithful to God's will at the time of the end turned into an enemy of God's faithful remnant. Next week, we'll continue the study from verse 7 and onward. You know, many people ask when they study the book of Revelation, when will these things happen? The answer is, we don't know. Only God knows the exact time. But one important fact is that the book of Revelation is about fixing a cosmic problem and not about when these events will happen. It is about fixing a problem causing cosmic imbalance that concerns us, human reality, and all our history. Another question people frequently ask is, why is Revelation so complicated? John should explain everything to us and not leave us guessing, they said. Well, a professor from Loma Linda University answered. He said, well, true. The message of this book seems as if it has not been completed in the level of the speaker. He continued. He said, perhaps it is designed to be completed on the level of the recipient. Do you remember in chapter 2 and 3? Repeatedly, the Spirit said to the churches, he who has an ear, let him hear. Maybe the Spirit is suggesting that what we hear and how we hear is important. So let us continue to study this book carefully so that we can clearly hear the message that is intended for us. Happy Sabbath.